because we do have that. And so it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Jen Frahm. Now, starting off today is Dr. Jen, who joins us all the way from Victoria, Australia, specifically Melbourne in Victoria. Now, Melbourne is the birthplace, if you don't know, of the Aussie Rules Football League, the AFL Football League. And the best AFL team, bar none, in the entire league are the Collingwood Magpies. I don't know if you knew that, but it's true. The best AFL team are the Collingwood Magpies, which Jen doesn't support.
Jen has teeth.
Jen has teeth. Yeah. The Collingwood Magpies might be one of the rougher teams with tats and no teeth. But they happen to be the team that I support when I lived in Melbourne, Australia. So that's why, not that Jen and I have had conversations about that already. But the good news is, regardless of how wrong she is about her football team, she has a huge amount of experience and expertise regarding change. She has a doctorate in management, has worked with a wide range of companies, including ANZ, the Australian New Zealand Banking Group, TAC, which is the Transportation Accident Commission, and also a longtime supporter of the Collingwood Magpies. They were the sponsor. Telstra, the University of Melbourne, many others. She's been involved in cultural change, digital transformations, business agility changes, operating model changes, and large-scale technology changes. You know, one or two little things like that. Now today, with so much to focus on change as it's happening, and as most of us in this room are involved in helping make that change happen, the latest technological advances are really coming at us with a cost. So today, Dr. Jen is going to offer us some qualities that we need to be present to support us through this change. Please welcome Dr. Jen.
Thank you. Thank you. What a joy to be here. I'm seriously thrilled, and I want to express my gratitude to the organising committee. This has been a conference that has been, whilst running for 5 years, has been well known for its curation of pretty awesome content. And as someone who loves to watch Twitter feeds, it's been pretty exciting to watch, and I've found a lot of value. So to be here is even more. Now, can I just do a check in the room? How many people identify as humans? Is there anybody who's not had their coffee yet? A little bit not human? Okay, I think we're in pretty good shape, because this is a talk about humans and zombies, albeit I woke up this morning and went, this has become rock, paper, scissors around raptors, zombies and humans. But that's okay, we're going to roll with that. As is the way of Spark, as I understand it from your past conferences, there is usually some level of overlap with previous speakers the day before, right? That's the beauty of a theme. Which when I heard yesterday's speakers, who were so fabulous, I was thinking, now I really need to be on the Friday afternoon, because every time I say something that's been said before, we'll turn that into a drinking game, because Australian. But no, that's okay. So what I'm going to do today is use my talk as a synthesis for you, right? You will hear things that were covered yesterday, but this is your invitation to go deeper on those concepts, right? So take them a little bit further and think a little bit further and deeper around those. I am talking about radical humanity. I've been working with tech firms for a while and technology transformations for some time, and I've got this hunch. We get very excited about the world being volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And we get in a little bit of a fervour about that. But my hunch is that with all this relentless adoption of technology, we're starting to become more than a little unhuman. Right? We're starting to see a bit of a tech zombie-inspired apocalypse upon us. And so my goal today is to equip you to be able to beat the tech zombie apocalypse. And I say it's a zombie apocalypse because it's about brains. Literally. And we heard a bit of this yesterday around the neurobiology of change and what's happening. And my argument with this, or my concern, is that we get very fervish again. We get very buzzy about neuroplasticity, and we can rewire our brains. But it stands to reason, if we can rewire our brains for benefit and growth, we also rewire our brains for deficit. And that's where we're coming into this zombie kind of space. Now, for the structure bunnies in the room, we're going to cover a lot of terrain in this talk, right? I can promise you that. So I'm going to give you a little pacing. We'll be chased by the zombies as we go. And in this talk, what we're going to do is cover what's causing the tech zombie apocalypse. Spoiler alert, it's a lot of change. We'll have a look at, despite all this change, what's staying the same. And then we're going to look at what's the antidote to the tech zombie apocalypse. And I like to think that this is a pacing device for you to keep up, but let's be serious. I'm on the opposite side of the world and my brain is upside down, so this is for me. But bear with me. Okay. So, a little bit about me. I am, for one of those corporate types, someone who sits in the space that overlaps between a geek and a nerd. In Gladwell's language, I am a maven connector. That will be very important. If anybody who's kept up with the 5 most important skills required to survive a zombie apocalypse will know that connectors are right up there with foragers and mechanics who can do anything with a rusty fork, right? In terms of my geek bona fides, I was one of the earliest members of Match.com back in about 1996. When your opportunities for meeting men online meant that they would speak to you in the sweet dulcet tones of ASCII, and you'd probably have to roll a 10-sided dice to work out if you wanted to see them again. So I know my geek space, right? It's fair to say in the world of swipe right, we have a lot more diversity, for better or for worse. I started tweeting back in 2008. I've had a podcast for a number of years now, and I'm an early adopter of technology. So ask me what I learnt about behaviour change with Pokemon hunting. Actually, it's another talk. But suffice to say, someone was really curious around what I learned about Pokemon hunting. Suffice to say, if there's a new technology trend coming through, I'm probably trying it because I'm really curious around what does it mean for the work we do? You know? And I don't think we can be disrespectful of any fad that comes through. That is our job as agents of change, of people who are on the frontier of change, to be relentlessly curious about, hey, let's have a play with this and see what we learn. I am human. I weep, I bleed, I laugh, I love. And I breathe. Sometimes forget about that one, but I do breathe. So I've got a lot of skin in this game. Humanity is important to me. I mentioned before that we're operating in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment. So hands up if you haven't had VUCA come into your organisation or the language start to permeate your strategic plans. So everybody's got VUCA in their strategic plans? Yep. And it's really interesting because VUCA as a term, you know, VUCA's 35 years old now, right? Military, Cold War, how do we explain that? And all of a sudden it's become part of our language. But we have started to adopt an assumption around VUCA that we must go with it in a fairly mindless way. It's become fait accompli. And this is where I'm really concerned about the zombieing. What it means, though, for us is that in today's context, we need to lead differently. We need to work differently, we need to think differently, and we need to deliver change differently. So the need for change management has not gone away as much as we would like to think. It does mean that we need to do it differently. Now, there's 4 reasons I would argue that we're seeing this techno-zombie apocalypse. There is this incredibly puzzling, it's almost petulant demand for business agility, right? So, and I see a lot of it as the Me Tooism. They're doing it, we need to do business agility as well. There is a remarkable space that we're operating at the moment in terms of geopolitical extremes. We've got fascinating disruption in media space at the moment, and we've got really wild technology that we're having to deal with. And I appreciate that wild technology is always relative, right? I appreciate that 100 years ago, what they saw was considered wild. But that means we can't dismiss it. So let's get into those and look at the first one of those topics. So, business agility. Dale will appreciate this. When I said before that I was going to be synthesising topics and we'd be talking things, I met the speakers the day before. I didn't expect audience members to come up to me and say, well, look, the minute you see HBR you see business agility on the front of HBR, you know how yesterday it is, right? Because I was like, damn it, that's my line, that's my line. But kudos to Dale. So this is the thing. Once we do see it being mentioned on, Forbes.com and HBR, it is truly yesterday that we're facing with. I'm a real fan of the Business Agility Institute. I'm a member of them. I think they've done great work in starting to define what the domains of business agility are beyond the operational stuff, beyond the things that we do with software teams. And so if you're curious around what business agility might look like beyond how do we operationalise agility, you do well to do that, to look at that. Evan Leyburn, the founder, CEO of the entity, I think he said it really well, because I often get asked this question, is like, do we have to do this? Do we have to? And the answer is no. If your environment is predictable, your circumstances are clear, the cost of change is high, then you don't need to do business agility. It's not necessary for you until such time a disruptor enters your market. And then you've been caught napping. And that is the challenge for us, is the notion of one little disruptor entering into a market, and all of a sudden we have to change the whole way that we work. The disruptor creates uncertainty, and our brains, what we know about neurobiology is that our brains privilege certainty. We heard yesterday from Aaron around complexity and complex systems. And this really feeds into our experience of complex systems, is that the disruptor is something that we can't plan for. And, you're familiar with the butterfly effect? So the initial sensitivity to initial conditions can change with one little deviation to the system, and it's massive. This is what we talk about with business agility and why it's so challenging. Our second cause of the techno-zombie apocalypse is that we are now operating, doing business in these wild geopolitical extremes, right? We've got the rise of the strongmen and the totalitarian regimes that we're having to do business with. We have compassion and empathy as policy mechanisms, with leaders who are starting to talk of compassion. And this is an aside. You know something is up when a suburb in a country outside of New Zealand pays for someone to come and paint the likeness of the New Zealand's Prime Minister on factory silos, right? This is just outside next neighbouring suburb from me. You get off the train and you're faced with the Prime Minister of another country. It is truly crazy times. So strong men, compassionate, and we've got these curiously inept and dangerously comical characters out there at the moment. I'm going to let you put faces onto that one. It's wild. It's wild to have to operate with that. When we're thinking about power, if you're a fan of Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Tim's, you'll know about their book of New Power. And what they're arguing in this is that we are seeing a radical change in how we experience power in our organisations, in our communities, in our political scenes. And this creates a really disruptive space for us. It is tempting to think that some of the tensions that we're seeing between the strong men and the compassionate is this fight for dominance between old power and new power. And the more that the new power come forward, the louder and the stronger that the old power go. But we are operating in a complex system. It is not a one-to-one relationship. And so the thrill for us with that is the potential for emergence of whole new states of political space. It's also our terror. And we often retreat into a space of cognitive dissonance. We can't believe that what we are seeing. All of a sudden, The Handmaid's Tale has become a preemptive documentary for us. So, what that means for us, we're experiencing cognitive dissonance and fear with what we're seeing in the geopolitical space. Now, that we have had quirky stuff happening politically is not new for us. What is new for us now is we've got this changing media landscape, citizen journalism, the arguments now around our technology platforms having influence on the nature of democracy. Who has not seen Carol Cadwallad's TED talk on... Okay, a couple of you. I'm going to tweet out the link to it later for you. It's really fascinating. It came out 2 months ago, and she spoke at TED in front of the tech giants, and she made the case for how Facebook had enabled the perversion of the democratic process in Wales when it came to the Brexit argument through the placement of fake news into those postcodes or that particular region. A month ago, Australia had its new Prime Minister voted in, and we followed the Trump and Brexit tradition of polls saying one thing, voters doing another. Within 3 days, the analysis come out that there'd been this fake news perpetuated through the areas that had experienced bizarre swings that nobody could have seen. And so what that means for us is our brains are now having to sort through information and disinformation and trying to work out which way it is. Edelman's Trust Barometer this year comes out, says that 73% of us worry about false information or fake news being used as a weapon. And our technology platforms that we take this in are complicit in this. We also, from a brain neurobiology perspective, rely on cognitive biases. And these are a zombie tool of trade. So our cognitive biases are shortcuts to thinking. And most of them will lead us down a very unsavoury path when it comes to making judgments from a political perspective. But if we had to process everything naturally, you'd be in a fetal position in the corner, right? If we had to put all of the cognitive biases to one side and go, how do I sort through this? It would be incredibly difficult for us to do. Marshall McLuhan was famous for his statement around the medium is the message. And what this means is that we're not only paying attention to the content of the message, but they're also influenced by the medium that shares that message. And with the use of all our technological platforms, they are embedded with behavioural cues that are influencing our brains, right? Again, our ability to face into that is really challenging. So, brains are currently under a lot of stress in terms of what's happening in this volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. Thing that really tops it off is this wild technology. Hands up if you have not seen Amy Webb's South by Southwest 2019 video. Okay? You're going to love it, okay? You're going to love it, but you're going to be terrified. Really terrified. It's an hour, but it's totally worth watching. Not only that, her Future Institute makes open source all of their information. So all of you who are thinking about the future of your industry need to be there having a look at what she's got coming through for you. It's an incredible resource. So she says there's 7 things that are really at the moment on the future of our wild technology. She's talking about the end of smartphones. As addicted as we are to smartphones, it's all going to be about wearables. Now, this is really interesting for us. So depending on the way you look at things, wearables means either a brave new world of constant surveillance, hello new increased health insurance claims, or the more positive take on it of continuous ambient monitoring, which means luckily your GP is going to give you a call and say, hey, your Apple Watch is telling me that you're about to have a heart attack. Can you pop into ER? Either way, you've got a lot of your personal data that is being used continuously, right? She talks about the artificial intelligence ecosystem growing. And this, again, has a lot of excitement for us, but there's some really, really big warnings for us at the moment about this. Notably, that whether it's machine learning or AI, the algorithms are being created by white males. No disrespect to the white males in the room. What it means that there is inherent bias in what's coming through. The other thing is the nature of our algorithms at the moment is that they're built for convergence of the mean. What this means is that when they take a full data set, they're looking for the averages to determine how you use that data. And so we ignore the outliers on it. So we've seen Amazon get into trouble with their recognition program, which has trouble with identifying non-white females. We've seen resume scanning products come out who've been built off who were the successful candidates in the past, which means when they see women's college, women's clubs, women's this, they dismiss it. And so we're really leading into quite a problematic space when it comes to this AI ecosystem. She also calls out the rise of the splinternet and decentralized internet. So examples of this, if you look at China and the firewall in terms of what they can consume within China and what they can exclude. But it's not just within China, right? Just this week, when we saw the riots happening in Hong Kong, we started to see the purging of accounts on Twitter. So we've got some really dangerous stuff happening around us, which is splitting us up in terms of the information that we can consume on the internet. She obviously calls out eyes on China, and let me tell you, I was there last year for a trade delegation, and it completely blew me away. And I realised how ignorant we in Australia were, that we've made all these assumptions about China and technology and completely underestimated the volume of policy changes that have gone on there and the funding systems that create innovation. So we went to Huawei, we went to Galaxy World, Neo House, BYD, and the stuff I saw there was phenomenal, particularly when I think about my clients and what they're trying to do. And I'm like, why are they putting all these teams onto building all of this when they just have to partner? But are we prepared to partner with countries that are so dramatically different to the way we operate? She flags that policy will continue to fall behind. You only have to work in large organisations to know that this is part of our business as usual, right? HR policy, InfoSec, technology policies can't keep up with the technology that we want to use and we need to use to be able to get our jobs done. And she talks about the consolidation of startups in larger entities. Again, in China, every large organisation that we went into had floors and floors of startups, accelerators, incubators going, because that's their feeder system of innovation. And I don't know about what you've got in Canada, we don't see that in Australia. You know, the startup struggle. And then finally, and this is where it becomes really overwhelming for our brains, is the convergence of all of these trends. It's not like we're dealing with one and then we have to deal with another. They all compound, which is really challenging. Just yesterday came out CNET, one of the things that I've been following, because I met with Professor Lee Hang last year at a conference, who has been doing a lot of the work on deep fakes. So how you use facial mapping technology. And so it's interesting because he's turned his work now to how do we protect politicians and celebrities from people who are using fairly basic technology to create situations that would trick us, right? And so he's done the example of where the researchers at Washington University took the voice of Obama's speech and then mapped it onto a completely different face, experience, scenario setting. So how are our brains meant to be looking at that and determining, is this actually real or is this not? And yes, we can talk about, the risk of someone creating a constitutional crisis, but it's going to happen in our organisations. How handy would it be for us as corporate communicators if we have a dud CEO that we can then recreate their likeness and push videos out? Right? Their town halls just became on message and interesting. Just saying. So, if you spend time, right, you're getting excited now, aren't you, Sue?
Yeah, because that's my background.
So, jump over to socialcooling.com. You will see plenty of examples of how our data is already being used against us. And this is happening in a relatively mindless space. We are zombied out to what is happening. So, a lot of change is happening for us. It is painful for us. It is difficult for us. Our brains have not been built to process all of this change. What I want to talk about then, if we've got all this change coming through, what's staying the same? Now, I would argue, and this is interesting because I was listening to Aaron's talk yesterday, which he had some views around change and change management in. And I'm going to respectively disagree with a lot of what he's saying. Because even, he argued that when we give people a car, they're fine with change. Even when we do change with people, not to them, even when we co-create change, we're not giving them cars, right? We're not giving them wads of cash. We're giving them opportunities to feel like a newbie, to feel like they don't know what they're doing. We're giving them new processes, which means they have to process loss. After 20 years in the field, and even working with all of these really sexy companies, the changes I work on inevitably have a lot of loss involved of them. There is a reason why we still bring out Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and loss. What you need to know is that really good change practitioners know the difference of when to use those models and when not to. Right? The other thing that he talked about, which really fits into this beautifully, was that it fundamentally comes down to two principles. People conscious, which is perfect. That's what I'm saying. Our need to support people through change remains the same. But being conscious of complexity. Once we go down that path and we start following those how to deal with complexity, we create a contradictory experience for people. Because when we go down to emergence and experimentation and all those kind of things, we're creating a sense of anxiety for people. They're not going, oh joy, here's an experiment. Because here's the thing, they're being hit by 30 experiments at the same time. We're not looking at the cognitive load of people in organisations. So we have to be mindful. So I fully agree with the two principles, but we have to be mindful about how we apply them and not just assume that they are people first and complexity conscious. Let's go ahead. They're actually a tension that creates pain, which means we need to support people through change. So to Aaron's point, he talked about, this myth of people don't like change. And he is right in that that is a myth. People don't like loss. They don't like insecurity. They don't like anxiety. They don't like feeling like newbies. And all those things emerge out of this new world. Let's have a look at a bit of neurobiology. Now, let me just check. Barring Selena and Marsha Schenk, because you're just going to have to hold on with this one, are there any other neuroscientists in the room? No? Good. because I am about to bastardize this field, right? I don't have a full day to cover this, so I'm going to go fast. It's going to be ugly for Marsha and Selena, but work with me. When we talk about brain functioning and change, there's three parts of the brain that we're really interested in. The first is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for doing all of our smart thinking, okay? So that's your rational thinking, your strategic, that's where you're getting people to do all the really good stuff. There is the reptilian brain at the back, which is responsible for basic survival. It is sleep, sex, hunger. It's also short-term memory function. I'll get to that in a moment. The middle part of the brain that we're interested in is the limbic system, and this is the part that does the incredibly rapid processing of threats to work out how do we keep you alive. So this is what generates your freeze, flight, fight response. Hellishly useful when your plane is crashing, when your house is burning down, when you're running from a squad of zombies. Not so useful when you're dealing with change every day in your organisation. Because what we know from the research is that when under threat, your limbic system is under threat, it has what Daniel Goleman terms the amygdala hijack. And when that happens, you have a diminishing of the neural pathways to your front brain, which does all your strategic thinking. Asking people to think their way out of a change and come up with good ideas at a time when they're inflamed, their limbic system is going, hang on, I think I'm under threat, is really improbable. The link to the short-term memory is interesting. So when we look at firefighters, special ops teams, Navy SEALs that do drills day in, day out, what they're doing is they're creating a stronger neural pathway to their short-term memory because they know that when they go into a space of extreme danger and a threat, they won't be able to think so cleverly. So this becomes really interesting for us in change because most change that we see introduced in organisations, so whether it's business agility, whether it's what we're seeing politically, whether it's technology, or even media, comes to us as a threat that we're feeling uncomfortable with. Now, the model that has been, sorry? I know, it's just, pardon? He was your teacher, yeah. Seriously, as I said, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I wish I had this at the beginning. I so wish I had this at the beginning. But it was developed in response to technology improving, right? So once we had MRIs and we could actually image the brain, David Rock and his researchers were able to look at what are the elements that are most likely to create a threat response in our brains. And what I say to leaders today, barring change management teams, barring change approach, change strategies, if there's only 5 elements you think about when you're introducing a change and it's these 5 elements, you'll be in such a stronger position than when you were going to start. So the 5 elements are status, and that's not just about is your job role changing, are you moving from a senior consultant to a consultant? That's anytime we have to learn something new and we feel like we're a beginner again, we drop in status, right? And we feel quite, that beginner's mindset is uncomfortable for us as a threat. Certainty, we talked about the certainty. Who here goes hiking? Oh, you're considerably fitter than Australia. Familiar with the experience of it always feels longer going there when it's coming back? Yeah? That's because our brain is in a position when we're going there where it's uncertain. So it's channeling all of its kilojoules, calories, energy to seeking certainty. Is there a tiger around the next corner? Is there a drop bear that's going to come out of that tree? Are we going to fall over a cliff? On the way back, the brain's going, no, I got this, stand down. Right? Don't have to put so much energy into it. And that's why it feels so much quicker when you come back. Autonomy. So we've known for ages perceived control has been important in change. But now we know more about what's actually happening at a brain function around that. This is why your micromanagers create such a damaging space for people because of that threat to autonomy. Relatable. basically we're asking the question, are you one of my tribe or are you going to eat me? Okay, long-term change practitioner. Anybody want to have a guess at the one change I will not do? No. Pardon? Layoffs? Prefer not to, but I won't veto them. Anybody? Pardon? No, I'll do a merger. I've done mergers. They're fun. Relocations and desk changes. World of pain. Seriously? Because it messes with people on the relatability side. You move them from their community, their tribes, their people, and you are in a world of pain as a change manager, right? Everything else can be worked. And then F, which is fairness. Is this a fair and equitable decision process? Again, we've got research which is 40 years old which tells us that perceived equity matters in change, right? That people are actually okay with layoffs if they understand the reason why and it's deemed to be fair and equitable. We now have the neuroscience behind it. So, how we become zombified? Fear of surveillance, denial of changes coming through, we disengage from future directions, diminished empathy, numbing of anxiety, mindfulness reacting or acceptance, and not questioning, right? It's all what we're facing into at the moment. What's the antidote? Right. Everybody poised with pencils. It is radical humanity, right? Radical humanity. Now, the concern I have, I had this thought as I'm putting this together, is like, seriously, when did it become a radical concept to be a human being? Right? Probably about the same time when we started thinking that psychological safety was important. They're two concepts which should just be taken for granted. We shouldn't have to talk about them. And yet here we are. They dominate our conversations. So, first of the qualities I'm going to take you through is empathy. Now, empathy is the ability to identify and understand the feelings of another. You don't have to agree with those feelings. You don't even have to experience those feelings. You just have to recognise that those feelings are happening there. And it becomes really important to us in change when we get the response from people that we're not being understood, that, nobody actually is thinking about us anymore. I remember my very first change was a merger and acquisition. It was a global merger and acquisition. And as I reported up that the morale of the employees was really challenging, this was back in the 90s, the voice came down from the global president. The next person who talks to me about morale will not be in the company. And yeah, true story, right? And the thing is, that lack of empathy impacted the clients and the customers dreadfully. Because it wasn't just the workforce who had a really difficult time, it meant they were doing a really crap job with the clients and the customers. And so the company really, really suffered. I was doing a workshop with a group of leaders recently where they brought me in because the data from the employee surveys suggested that there was a complete lack of empathy with the leadership team. Really nice fellows, right? They weren't mean. They just didn't really understand this concept of empathy. And it was really fascinating because at 3 hours into it, one of the execs, he threw his hands up in the air and he was like, "Stop, stop, stop," in a very heavy Brazilian accent. "We must stop." I'm like, oh, this is not going how I thought it was going to go. And he was like, "We cannot be psychologists." And I'm looking at him. He's like, "It's not my job to make people happy." And I'm looking at it, I'm like, "So based on the last 3 hours, where have I mentioned happiness?" And he's like, "You can't expect me to be a psychologist." And I'm like, "No, but from a board-qualified psychologist and an executive engineer in a supply chain company, there's probably a lot of ground you could cover to get there." And I was really lucky because the GM of the company was in the room and he said, "No, I don't expect you to be a psychologist. I expect you to be a leader." It was really, really powerful. But what that taught me was that people's understanding of what empathy is can be wildly different to what we assume. If we become versed in Brené Brown, if we become versed in this whole world, often we're looking at it from a lens which is very, very sophisticated to what's experienced in our leadership teams, and we have to unpack that. Empathy is massively important in change. You think about all of the move towards design thinking and human-centred design in change. It is all based on empathy. I think what's really important, though, is that often we hear this discourse around leaders need to be empathetic, like the example I just gave you. We don't hear so much about we need to be empathetic towards our leaders, because our leaders are often having to bring in changes that they haven't had input and want to bring in. We don't hear so much about being empathetic to our colleagues who are struggling with the change. And so for me, empathy is multi-directional, right? It's really important to consider that. It also improves your decision-making. If you take a lens of empathy, you'd be surprised what actually comes up in terms of the decisions that you make. It becomes a conduit to better communication and collaboration. The minute we start expressing empathy, we build trust, and trust is our currency of change. Now, one of the things that we hear a lot about with empathy is that technology has diminished our capacity for empathy. Our brains have lost the ability to empathise because of technology. And I found this really interesting, so I spent some time looking into this. And I could not find research that would support this. Any research studies being done at the moment that tell us that the space where empathy comes from has become smaller because of technology. But let's have a look at some of the evidence out there. So, for those of you who are not on the dating scene at the moment, you may be interested to know that all of the dating apps at the moment have got a feature in it called the Unmatch. And the Unmatch means that you're mid-conversation with someone, you go, yeah, I'm not into them, unmatch without so much as a thanks, goodbye, good luck. It is the most brutal functionality that you could imagine in an online dating space. Now, imagine what happens in our meetings when people who become socialised to unmatching, because they're just not into you, sit in your meeting, not really into this meeting, just get up and walk out. Unmatch, without so much as a word. This is where we're heading, right? Uber has just introduced its Don't Talk to Me feature, right? Who knew that... Okay, apart from a couple of us in the room, who knew that there would be a need for that feature? What there is research on that shows you that since 2000, there has been a 40% decrease in empathy in student cohorts. 40% since the year 2000. Now, in that time, solo gaming and screen time has increased, and personal computing and the web came of age in the early 90s. Now, before anybody wants to start scowling at me, I do have a PhD. I do know that correlation is not causation. But personal computing, web, came of age in the 90s. By the 2000s, 40% decrease in empathy in student cohorts. Just saying. Interestingly, back to the research. What we do know in our research is that gaming creates dopamine hits similar levels to crack cocaine. So it's creating this intense addiction to our technology. And the addiction, we also see it with the children's solo screen time. You only have to go into any restaurant to see what's going on there. And what's really interesting is that children develop empathy through what's known as a call and respond process. You can only develop call and response through engagement with another human being. So, if you are spending more time solo on a screen, you are spending less time on a call and response experience, which is how you actually build empathy in your brain. And this is where it gets really quirky, is we've got this process called dendritic pruning. Use it or lose it. So when we stop using particular aspects of our brain, it's incredibly efficient, right? It wants to channel energy to other parts of our brain. And so it'll actually prune away those neural pathways to call and respond. Case in point, who was following Coachella? Right, Coachella, the big music festival this year. Casey Musgraves does a very basic call and respond to the crowd. I say ye, you say ha. Silence. Really? Let's test it. Zombies in the room. Ye? 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 Okay, we're safe. We're safe at this point. There are no zombies that have come in. This is good. That is a call and respond. But that's what we had. A whole crowd had lost the ability to do a basic call and respond. Now, if we think about the challenge of collaborating with supersized technology countries that we don't understand, empathy is our answer to this, right? If we think about the fear of that. Daniel Goleman gives us 3 types of empathy. Cognitive empathy is the one where we just have to understand how people think. And I think this is probably our answer to dealing with countries that we're either scared of or just don't understand. We don't necessarily have to move into emotional empathy or, the empathetic concern. How do we support each other? That would be lovely, but let's start with cognitive empathy. It's often been asked, can we teach adults empathy? And the research at the moment suggests, yes, we can, right? It's a bit of a task, but we can. It starts with showing people what the benefits of empathy is. You then move on to modelling what that looks like, being able to rehearse it and give some feedback. So what this means for us is that with attention, we actually can build empathy in our organisations. Now I'm going to test this and I'm going to give you an invitation to do something. Now, point of order, when I give you an invitation, you have a right to say, no thanks, Jen, I'm going to sit this out. Okay? But I would encourage, for those who want to test it, to give this a crack. Can you turn and face someone so that you have strong eye contact? So, Dave tested this yesterday, but only for a little bit. I'm taking it further, Dave. Face someone with eye contact. Okay. Going to read you a piece from one of my favourites, Ram Dass. It's called Human, Just Like Me. This person has a body and mind just like me. This person has feelings, emotions and thoughts just like me. This person has experienced physical and emotional pain and suffering just like me. This person has at some time been sad, disappointed, angry or hurt just like me. This person has felt unworthy or inadequate just like me. This person worries and is frightened sometimes just like me. This person will die just like me. This person has longed for friendship just like me. This person is learning about life just like me. This person wants to be caring and kind to others just like me. This person wants to be content with what life has given them just like me. This person wishes to be free from pain and suffering just like me. This person wishes to be safe and healthy just like me. This person wishes to be happy just like me. This person wishes to be loved just like me. Now allow for well wishes for well-being to arise. I wish this person to have the strength, resources and social support they need to navigate the difficulties in life with ease. I wish this person to be peaceful and happy. I wish this person to be loved because this person is a fellow human being just like me. How about it? It's quite lovely. There's a lot of empathy in the room. There's a lot of empathy in the room. And I'm deliberate when I say people don't have to do that. because I recognise, okay, if you need to hug it out, but you can high five if you're not the hugging person. Good job, good job. I'm deliberate when I give people an invitation because for some people that is extraordinarily difficult and uncomfortable process to do. And it is uncomfortable to do because of the next quality we need to double down on. Vulnerability. So, vulnerability, many of you would have felt incredibly vulnerable in that one. And I will note that the proportion of change practitioners who refused to do that was exceptionally high. There's something in that, yeah.
Would you be willing to share that list so that we could use that technique?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That'd be my pleasure. Yep. Okay, so vulnerability. Now, this is the thing. We've turned vulnerability into this term which was like, hey, we need to be more vulnerable and, you know, it's a good thing for us. Yeah, it's become really buzzy. When you get into the definition of it, vulnerability means you're prepared to risk harm to yourself. It is not a light trip to go on, right? There is a reason why. Brené Brown, hands up if you haven't seen The Call to Courage. Call to Courage on Netflix? Okay. So it's really worth seeing. Brené Brown, of course, is our guru in the space of vulnerability. Social researcher, storyteller, was famous for her research on when she was looking into shame, actually found in the data the stories of people who are leading wholehearted lives experience vulnerability without it being excruciating. What for most of us do is the process of experiencing vulnerability is excruciating and we seek to numb that, right? So whether it's alcohol, drugs, shopping, mindless TV, coffee, sugar, there's a whole stack of numbing activity goes on. But the problem is when we resist being vulnerable, we resist the potential for joy, optimism, innovation, creativity, all these really exciting things to doing. So it really becomes part of our risk-reward process. What I want you to think about is the notion of vulnerability as business as usual. Because for most of us, we access vulnerability when things have gone to shit, right? We've lost our job, we've lost our marriage, we've lost this, it's big. And we go, there's no resort, there's nothing left for us unless we are vulnerable and ask for help. Now, the benefits of vulnerability is if we tap into it on micro moments, that we're just that little bit more vulnerable in how we do. So important in change. When you are open and honest about your expectations in the change, and as you know, whether you're an employee, whether you're a leader, and you say, actually, I'm a bit uncomfortable about this, it makes me feel uncomfortable, what you're doing is you're opening up opportunities for people to relate to you and reduce stress in the workplace. When we talked about relatability, are you one of my tribe? Will you eat me? This is where vulnerability taps in, right? People can relate to you when you're open about your discomfort. Case in point, this is my Sam's story about his dancing with the girl. A couple of years ago, I had to speak at a conference. It was a group of change practitioners, and I had to give them messages about how they had to... Now you all want to take photos of the pole dancing? Like, seriously, that's not the one to take photos of. But anyway, so I'm at this event, and I decided... So I had to give them messages which were going to be really difficult for them to hear about how they had to improve themselves, that they were under par, and I knew that they weren't going to want to hear that from me. And I chose to incorporate a story, which for me was around courage. So the year before, I'd taken up pole dancing as exercise, because I'm a big believer in horizontal learning, right? Do something that makes yourself feel really uncomfortable. And as an aside, what I learnt about giving instructions and encouraging people who feel like they can't do something was amazing from those instructors. But the bit that I shared that resonated with them was the fact that every time I went into that pole dancing class, I was the oldest by 30 years, and I was the heaviest by 40 kilos. And that made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. That was the bit they took away, not the how you can learn. So when people came up to me in the breaks, it was about, they really related to me. And the fact that they could relate to that discomfort about age and weight was what had them listen to the message. So, how do you do this? What does it mean? We heard yesterday about the notion of boundaries with vulnerability. You do need to set your boundaries, right? To do vulnerability without boundaries is foolhardy. And one of my mentors is Daryl Connor, and he talks about go further than you could, no further than you should. I think it's wise. And again, we heard yesterday, own the experience, right? This is about your emotions. Don't be projecting on it. Cultivate a spirit of non-judgment. When you do this with a spirit of non-judgment, the less you judge others, the easier it is to be vulnerable comfortably. So, we're getting right to the end now. Courage. Courage is like vulnerability in that it's about BAU. We again think about courage in terms of doing big things. I'm going to walk into the CEO's office and I'm going to tell them this. I'm going to save the family from the burning house. You know, these crazy big things. Just think about it as a shift to the right? You're just going to move the dial on being a little bit more braver, regardless of what that means for you. So for some of you, it is about being more decisive, knowing that others are going to be unhappy. It could be to ask a question that once you ask that question, you can't take it back, right? Excuse me. It could be to delegate. We talk about new power. For many of you as leaders, the minute you have to start delegating, that's a courageous thing to do. That's actually brave. It's safe when you've got it all. The courage to say no, the fervour about business agility. One of the points of self-organising empowered teams is that you have control over your backlog. Most self-organising empowered teams have little control over a backlog, right? They just have to do it faster. Courage to say no. And then courage to let go of what you think is important. You know, this is the whole being safe to fail, means actually letting go of things. The burning platform has that impact a lot for people, right? So the burning platform, a lot of people think that you need to create a fire and a burning platform for people to create change. It's not what it was about. The metaphor was actually of courage and commitment. So Daryl Connor, in watching a show about the Alpha Piper oil rig, recognised that the fellow who survived and was telling the story told a story of courage and commitment. To stay on the platform was certain death. To leap off the platform was probable death, right? The water was littered with burning oil, lots of steel shards. He'd have 15 minutes to live if he survived the fall because of the temperature of the water. And so Connor saw in that moment the pattern he was seeing in leaders around courage and commitment. My challenge is you, don't let it get to where you've got to make a leap between probable death and certain death, right? These little steps, courage as BAU is what becomes your saviour. And it becomes useful when we look at some of these challenges that we've got, right? So the artificial intelligence, having the courage and the bravery to have a conversation about the ethics of just because the data is telling us we should do this, doesn't mean that that's what we should do in our organisations. That's a conversation of courage. Okay, curiosity is our fourth quality that we're going to double down on. Curiosity is really interesting because I think, Dave, you spoke about it yesterday, the cult of busyness, right? Curiosity is interesting because it takes time to be curious. And in a workplace that worships the efficiency and the busyness, it's very hard to be curious. So curiosity, however, is what's going to help us with our fear of losing jobs and automation. It's going to help us with our fear of China and domination of technology and too much change coming through. It is the great enabler of change and transformation. It is really time inefficient. Curiosity will help us build a growth mindset, and those who've got kids, now is this happening in Canada as well? So are the education system all adopting positive psychology, growth mindset stuff? How awesome. Just a tiny bit. Oh, look, thin edge of the wedge, that's fine, you know. It's so important because it does build resilience and it overcomes defensiveness in change. And our challenge when we're feeling fear and we're starting to check out from a zombie perspective is to apply our beginner's mindset and question everything and think about it from a different perspective. Let's test and see if any more zombies have come in the room. What's that say? What was it?
Ice cream is good.
Really?
Ice cream is
It might not be.
Zombies crept into the room. This makes me unhappy. Beginner's mindset, people. Relentlessly question everything. I'm going to tweet some links to Merck's State of Curiosity study. It's well worth looking at. I think the takeaway for this, for me, is when you look at how they define curiosity, is its tolerance for distress is the marker as to whether we can be curious in the workplace. Nothing else. Tolerance for distress increases with tenure and job satisfaction. So when we're looking at how do we make organisations more curious. Equally, Eric Schonstrom's D-type curiosity, I-type curiosity, we focus on a deficit-based view of curiosity. We've got a problem, we've got to be curious about how to solve it. I-type curiosity is how do we play with ideas and love learning, and that's the one we need to amplify. Barriers of curiosity, we're too busy, we've got poor listening skills, that dendritic pruning, strong cognitive biases, overconfident, status conscious. Last one, mindful self-compassion. And again, we had a beautiful piece yesterday afternoon about that. This is the solution to there is too much technology, there's too much change, and we numb. Now, anybody who's familiar with Gareth Morgan's work, you'll know about the psychic prison, right? And that's where we get trapped in a situation of our mind's own making. And I see this all the time in change. So people say to me, we made all this progress and now we have backslid. We're back here again, right? It's actually a change slinky. It's a spiral. In context of where you've been before, you've made real progress. But our psychic prison and the fact that we are not compassionate to ourselves traps us into thinking that we've failed, we've not done well. Silent judgment zombifies us. So every time we go through a process of, I should have done this easier, I should know more, I should have been able to make this change, we are zombifying. We're relying on what's known as the default neural network. And the default neural network is influenced by our past and our future. That's what creates obsession, rumination, planning, and you're continually thinking. This is why mindfulness has become sexy. Mindfulness taps into the direct experience network, neural network, and it asks us, what are we experiencing in the here and now, and circuit breaks that past and future cycle going on. So the caveat I have on this is to beware of medicinal mindfulness, right? So we know that we're going to be stressed, so make sure we set the alarm and we'll do our 10 minutes of the calm app at 3 o'clock. The organisation that says, hey, we're going into a lot of change, let's create this room, put some bean bags in, a few plants. People can go and be mindful in there. It's medicinal mindfulness. And you know it when you've downloaded an app which talks about for busy people. It's medicinal mindfulness. The problem with medicinal mindfulness is that it hasn't looked at the other side of the coin, which is self-compassion. So from a Buddhist perspective, you cannot have mindfulness without compassion for self, which is so extraordinarily difficult for us to do. It's why we make mindfulness medicinal, because we sure as hell don't want to go into a space where we actively love ourselves, we accept ourselves, we think about ourselves. It's so very hard. And so you have this rinse and repeat process of mindfulness. Neff and Germer are really valuable to look into their research on this. They're starting to make real good tracks on it. And my challenge to you is to look in your mirror. Would you talk to your family, your friends, your colleagues, your loved ones, the way you talk to yourself? I suspect not. Which brings us back to radical humanity. Doubling down on mindfulness and self-compassion, it is the gateway to empathy, to curiosity, to courage, to vulnerability. I have an ask of you. You are human. You weep, you bleed, you breathe, you love, you laugh. I want you to double down on these 5 qualities: empathy, vulnerability, courage, curiosity, mindfulness and self-compassion. And I want you to go forth, you radical humans, and be, because it starts with you. I want you to connect with me, because I'm going to be really good in a zombie apocalypse.
Very cool. Thank you very much, Dr. Jen.
Very welcome.
All right. Hey, if people wanted to hear more about this, let's say they had a free day tomorrow and they wanted to, would there be a way they could connect with you? On your tables, there are, Dr. Jen is running a workshop in Toronto tomorrow from 9 until 12. If anyone wants to hear more, there's that. Jen also mentioned that she's going to be tweeting out some of this information, and I failed to mention it this morning, so shame on me. But we do have a Twitter hashtag, which is #SparkTO. If you want to tweet anything out today or share anything back, any of your observations or any of the things that, any of the statements that have resonated with you, please, I'd encourage you and invite you to do that on Twitter. Tag it with the hashtag, and it will share it with everyone else. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Wonderful.